Individuation, Volume 2, on the text History of the Notion of the Individual. We are still in ancient Greece, in this sort of history of Western philosophy, where we started the Epicurean section last time, and so we're going to continue with the Epicureans, and there's a specific section on Lucretius that we should get to today as well. And Simondon here sets out the Epicurean school as sort of the opposite of the Stoic school. That's sort of what we saw in the first bit of the section on the Epicureans. So whereas in Stoicism, the individual is incorporated into something greater than it, so this cosmic order in which the individual is just a component. Conversely, in Epicureanism, the individual is a composite out of the sort of primary individuals, which are the atoms. And so the atoms are what have sort of inherent individuality, and the human individual, or the various entities that we're familiar with in our everyday lives, are composites that are made up of many atoms. So there's the difference between Stoicism and Epicureanism at the ontological level has to do with whether individuality is something that is greater than the human scale in Stoicism, or lesser than the human scale in Epicureanism. And so those are sort of opposite orientations towards the relationship between individuality and the human scale. And then there's also a sort of, there's a difference in terms of how that relationship between the individual and the environment, or the milieu, is conceived in these two schools. So in Stoicism, there's this notion of the resonance of the individual with the milieu. So there's this is drawn from the theory of resonance of musical instruments and harmonic frequencies and so on, sort of the Pythagorean inheritance of the Stoic school. But there's this idea that the individual has to sort of find a way to resonate in harmony with the frequency of the milieu, of the environment. And so the environment is sort of the active participant, and then the individual is kind of passive in the sense that they have to respond to what the environment is. Whereas, and we'll see this when we pick up the reading today, in the Epicurean school, there's nothing active about the milieu in the same sense. The milieu is just composed of atoms and void, and so the individual is not doesn't have this need to incorporate itself into the milieu and resonate with the milieu. There's a completely different, it's a sort of reciprocal orientation between the milieu and the individual. Okay, so let's pick up from there for today's reading. So we're starting on page 492 of the translation. So I'll read the first page or so, and then we'll discuss as usual. Okay, and so we're starting about halfway down the page for those following. Conversely, in Epicurean theory, the milieu is not what subordinates the singular individual to the whole, for the milieu loses its character of activity proper. It is nothing more than the void. It is not capable of transporting itself in the form of an impact, certain quantity of energy arising from another body. It is only that which, due to its emptiness, makes possible the passage of every emanation, corpuscle, or thin layer with the form of the object that has emitted it. This essentially neutral and inactive, non-resistant, propertyless milieu allows its singular individuals to act upon each other by way of emission. Only movement and contact can put singular individuals in relation. Yet these actions are reciprocal and rigorously reversible, whereas the action of the milieu on the singular individual is the quintessence of the irreversible action. In the Epicureans, the theory of sensations, just like that of the formation of composites, conforms with the principle of the milieu's emptiness and the reversibility of actions. The first consequence of this refusal of the active milieu that binds all things together is the rejection of necessity, imarmene, or destiny. Epicurus says that quote, "It were better indeed to accept the legends of the gods than to bow beneath the yoke of destiny which the natural philosophers have imposed," unquote. For the Epicureans, there is no idea of a determined order that transforms the cosmos into a rational work wherein every event happens the moment it must happen due to a providential order. The ensemble of all things is nothing but a sum, the precious summa summarum, the sum of all sums, and not an individual being. This sum is infinite, and there is an infinity of worlds in an infinite space and an infinite time. The events that happen are not events of the cosmos. They are merely the result due to the chance encounters of elementary particles. Dynamism is not a dynamism of the summa summarum with fixed and determined intentions. It belongs to the elementary particles. This is how the notion of parenklesis, or klinamen, inclination, can be understood, a notion which is accepted by Epicurus and added to the atomistic physics of Democritus. The klinamen, in fact, attributes to the elementary particles an absolutely autonomous movement. This absolute initiative designates the particles not as simple parts of the whole, but as constituents. Movement is inherent to the particles. This physical individual, the particle, is the absolute origin of movement. This is because in Epicurean physics, the particle is not just that which remains at the end of the process of division, originating with a body of great size, and which is forced to halt at a minimum beneath which it cannot descend for physical or logical reasons. The Epicureans undoubtedly do not refuse this existence of minima, but they do not turn these minima into the whole reality of the elementary particle. The minimum, in fact, does not contain as reality anything but that of the fragmented whole, to which is added the failure of the human, ideal or real operation of division. The minimum thus takes its reality from the whole, in which it previously participated because it was a part of the latter when this whole was not yet submitted to the operation of division. The minimum qua minimum is therefore not a first reality. It is not an individual by itself, but solely due to the succession of an operation that has divided a whole and halted at some point at a certain level. This individual is a result, and as we will say today, an artifact, even if the failure of the operation of division, which in itself is indefinite, is due to a cause originating in the object grasped in its structure. Conversely, the Epicurean's elementary particle is a constitutive particle. It exists in the free state from the start. It is molecule and not atom, seed of things and not a result of their division. Its indivisible nature pertains to and stems from what it is, not from what it can be. In this sense, we feel the declination of the soul, the movement which allows it to modify the attitude of the body. It is in this way that we must envision the declination of molecules, i.e., as a spontaneous movement. Molecules therefore have a real positivity and independence. They are what constitute the composite. They exist and move prior to being the parts of a given composite. The forces by which they are joined do not depend on the whole within which they are found, but solely on the rapports of form and movement between molecules which are in contact with each other. Let's stop there with this multi-page paragraph. Right, so there's a few of the central notions of Epicurean physics that are introduced here. So in particular, the klinamen, which is the famous swerve of the atoms. So the universe consists of atoms falling in the void. But if that's all there was, if the atoms just fell straight down, then there would be no composition. Everything would just be just these individual atoms falling in a straight line. And so there's this notion of the swerve of the atoms. So the atoms have a kind of freedom. They're capable of deviating from this downward path, and because of this deviation or this swerve, the downward paths combine with each other or collide with each other and produce composites. And this is ultimately the origin of all the entities that we're familiar with. Planets and stars and trees and stones and so on are all products of this swerve of the atoms in the downward motion. And as a result of this conception of the atoms as having freedom, there's a rejection of the Stoic notion of destiny. So there's no sort of pre-programmed nature of the future. Everything is due to chance encounters of atoms in the void, and so there's no notion of a necessary progression of events through time like there is in Stoicism. And then another bit here has to do with this notion of the atom as a minimum. And so Simondon argues here that we have to understand the atoms not as purely as the minima of a division process, but as something that has an inherent individuality distinct from that. So if we just think of atoms as minima of division, then we treat the composite as the primary reality. We take a stone or a tree or whatever as something that it has reality in itself, and then we divide that reality up into its component parts, and we continue dividing until at some point we reach a limit where we can't divide anymore. And that's sort of a logical conception of what an atom might be. But instead, we have to think in the Epicurean system, we have to think of the atoms as having inherent reality on their own, and not just as components, or not just as the result of a division process. And so it's the atoms that are the primary realities, and the composite entities are secondary. They have existence or reality only sort of derived from their the atoms that compose them. Okay, so let's go on to the next page or so if you'd like to read.
Yes. Which line are we starting with?
We're at the fact that action through contact.
Okay. The fact that action through contact is the only one retained is capable of explaining the phenomena of nature, reserves for the molecules the initiative of any transformation that intervenes in the composite. The composite is a sum, a finite sum, whereas the world is an infinite sum. The elementary molecule is what possesses an immanent and perpetual movement. There is one exception to this rule of the spontaneity and independence of molecules, the eternal fall of molecules through the infinite void. Strictly speaking, it would be necessary to explain the existence of this field of gravity. However, the ancients did not have ideas as clear as those provided by Newton's system. Weight should appear to the Epicureans as a property of the molecule, and not as a force proportionate with the product of two masses and inversely proportionate with the square of their distance. Weight is not distinguished from mass, and therefore can be considered as a characteristic proper to the molecule, whereas in fact mass alone is a characteristic proper to the molecule. In this way, the notion of field and force of attraction does not intervene. At any rate, it would be contrary to the presuppositions of this physics, because it would create a causality of the whole, accompanied by a possibility for the whole to impose a movement of the ensemble onto all singular individuals. The idea of a field of forces implies another conception of the rapport between elementary individuality and totality, whether this field of forces be conceived as immaterial or as materialized by a milieu. In this refusal of everything that would be assimilable to a field, the Epicurean physics is distinguished not only from Stoicism, which materializes the field of forces under the auspices of seminal and artistic fire, but also from Aristotle's rationalism. Any attraction of the inferior by the superior, any direction through a unique principle imposing a rational finality upon everything that happens in the universe is inconceivable when every influence at a distance, i.e., every field of forces, is denied. It should be noted that no field is absolutely necessary for explaining the combination of molecules. The principle of inertia and the conservation of motion would suffice. The Epicureans suppose a fall of the molecules in the infinite void because this fall is an inexhaustible reservoir of potential energy in each molecule, which makes possible the explanation of all the combinations that form beings in the course of time. Under these conditions, the quantity of energy that represents the clinamen is extremely low. The greatest part of the energy necessary for the formation of composites in reality originates from the movement of falling in the void, which is deviated by the clinamen, but which acts in accordance with its own energy. The clinamen is an extremely low control energy that occasions the manifestation of much more considerable quantities of energy. Furthermore, it must be acknowledged that the clinamen is proper to each of the corpuscles, whereas the fall in the void does not distinguish one corpuscle from another, since all movements are parallel. Consequently, the fall cannot produce an action that would be an expression of the spontaneity of each molecule, cannot have any productive initiative, and it has to be brought to act at a determined instant by something that comes from the particular individual. This initiative constitutes the rigorously irreducible aspect of the physical individual. The Epicurean's atomic molecule is therefore something other than a minimum. It is that which has an unalterable magnitude and form and can be endowed with initiative and spontaneity. So it seems like part of the point of this is that Epicurean physics would not be able to countenance the idea of gravity, because gravity uh, is is a kind of field attraction that would attribute some kind of dynamism to the void, which would be incompatible with Epicurean physics, in which all dynamism has to originate with the individual atoms themselves.
Yeah, I think that's mostly right. The only point where I think maybe I would correct that is I think the notion of gravitation or attraction doesn't, strictly speaking, attribute dynamism to the void. It's a slightly different sort of physical schema that is involved. It's attraction or action at a distance between the particles. So the particles attract each other across a distance, and it's this action at a distance that they have to reject because in the Epicurean physics, all action is through contact, and so allowing for something like gravity would mean allowing atoms to operate on each other or to influence each other at a distance, and this would be something kind of mysterious, and even in like the 16th century or 17th century when 17th century, sorry, when the Newtonian theory of gravity is developed, this notion of attraction at a distance is conceived as something mysterious, and a lot of the Cartesian school rejects gravity for that reason.
Interesting.
And so this general principle of trying to explain the world in non-mysterious ways, and incorporate these very simple and comprehensible schemas of action, like the contact of two particles with each other. I think it's this general approach to physical explanation that makes them have to reject anything like a field of attraction, a gravitational field. But yes, so they understand. So because they don't have any notion of a gravitational field, they understand the weight of the particle as an inherent property, as opposed to a relationship between one particle and another particle. Where in the post-Newtonian worlds we understand weight as a property, as a relative property. So there's a certain weight of a stone on Earth and a different weight on the moon or whatever. The weight of an object depends on its mass, on an inherent property, and also on the gravitational field in which it's found. Whereas the Epicurean physics sort of combines weight and mass into one inherent property of this capacity or necessity of falling in the void. And this is another sort of opposition with the Stoic physics, because the Stoic physics is all about these sort of fields of influence of different entities on each other. They all interpenetrate each other and influence each other in various ways, and the whole universe is ultimately one giant field that is sort of resonating in this very complicated way that produces all the different entities that we see in the universe. And so these are two completely opposed ways of explaining the physical worlds. This sort of corpuscular and mechanistic picture that the Epicureans have, and this field dynamic picture that the Stoics have. And then there's also this bit which I think is Simondon's sort of original contribution here, is conceiving the clinamen as a kind of control energy. And so we can think of some of the material from the other book on the mode of existence of technical objects, where he's talking about, there's a long section about vacuum tubes, which is a little bit obscure for those of us who were not around in the 1950s when this was the sort of technology of the time. But he talks about how these vacuum tubes use a sort of control energy to you have like a low energy signal that controls the flow of a much stronger current of energy. And similarly, we can think of the Klineman as a kind of signal or modulation of this much greater flow of energy in the downward falling of the particles. And so we this sort of modulation is what brings about the structures that we see in entities that we are familiar with, and so we ultimately everything that we know is a kind of modulation of the falling of atoms, and this kind of signal superimposed on this falling of atoms.
Do you think it would be accurate to say that the Klineman of each atom has an individuating function with respect to that atom? At the end of this paragraph, before the Lucretius section, where he says that ends with the sentence that the initiative of the Klineman constitutes the rigorously irreducible aspect of the physical individual. I guess whereas if it was just the fall through the void, there would be nothing to distinguish one atom from another.
Yeah, I think that's right. So if you just had atoms falling in the void, each track, the path that each atom falls would be parallel, and there would be no way to distinguish one from the other. And it's not in, especially in because we have an infinite universe, it's not even clear how we would say that you have one path versus another. Like, how do you distinguish one location where a certain path is of an atom is falling, and a second location where a second atom is falling? The two points of space through which the atoms fall are indistinguishable. And so in order to be able to make a distinction between different points of space and different paths of atoms, and then ultimately between the atoms themselves, we have to have some notion of spontaneity of the atoms. So the atom is an entity that has this sort of internal principle of motion that allows it to deviate from this falling in the void. And it's this principle, this internal principle of motion, that makes it something individual and distinct from all the other atoms. Okay, so let's go on to the Lucretius section. And maybe I'll just preface this by saying that Lucretius, of course, was an Epicurean. So here, this is still continuing on the Epicurean school. But Lucretius is his book is sort of the canonical text that we have left to us of the Epicurean school, because Epicurus's writings, we have like some of his letters and I think some fragments of other texts, but we don't have like a book from Epicurus outlining his whole system. So Lucretius is kind of the canonical text that we have to refer to as the like systematic setting out of the Epicurean philosophy. Okay, so I'll read the first page. Lucretius. However, alongside the vigorous restoration of physical individuality, it seems that there is for the Epicureans, at least for Lucretius, a certain omnipresent or at least subjacent idea of the force of the universe in its ensemble qua nature. The sum of sums is indeed also substantial. It is just as substantial as each of the elementary corpuscles because it is composed by their infinite sum. Yet it seems that this infinity of the sum is also more directly contemplated in the Ionian sense of the term, i.e. as the power of making beings grow after having engendered them, the power of ensuring that individual after individual succeeds in propagating the species, re-entering into nothingness after having momentarily carried the flame of life, like runners in a relay race who hand off the flame before collapsing in exhaustion. Lucretius has sung the immortal verses of this intuition of the continuity of life, its power to ever be born and re-emerge. He invokes this fertile nature through the strongest and most prestigious images of Greek or Oriental mythology: Demeter, Gaia, Cybele, and the Curetes are evoked in the memories of Ionian physiology. The goddess of amorous desire is invoked first through the vision of a subjugated world in which the elements are active and present. Venus is not just hominum divumque voluptas, joy of gods and men. She is also Alma Venus, Venus the life giver, who fills with life mare navigerum, the sea that carries the ships, and terras frugiferentis, the land that bears the crops. The sky changes its own appearance for the goddess. The winds, rains, and clouds depart, and an immense luminous peacefulness spreads over the horizons. Te dea te fugiunt venti, adventumque tuum, placatumque nitet diffuso lumine caelum. Thou goddess, thou dost turn to flight the winds, and the sky, its anger past, gleams with spreading light. The fertile breeze of Favonius thaws the frosts and brings forth life. Diget genitabilis aura Favoni. This term diget deserves to be highlighted for its expressive value. This is Venus's creative ardor, which exerts itself by exhibiting itself in the four elements. Venus is the physis of the four elements, the conspiring unity of their vital thrust. The earth itself is also transformed. Tibi suaves daedala tellus summitit flores. For thee, earth, the quaint artificer, puts forth her sweet-scented flowers. This underscores how Lucretius can say, Efficis ut cupide generatim cycla propagant. Thou dost strike fond love into the hearts of all, and makest them in hot desire to renew the stock of their races, each after his own kind. Physis no doubt seems to be more particularly imminent to the earth. Lucretius is a philosopher who is comparable to the Ionian physiologists. Yet while Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes chose water, the indefinite, aperon, and air as the fundamental element, Lucretius feels and expresses the existence of a telluric physis. Borrowing from mythology, the myth of Demeter and the story of the birth of the first man who emerges from a womb and rooted in the earth express this conviction. But physis penetrates all things and is not merely the living species. Must the existence of a finality of the whole therefore be accepted? The very notion of finality must be analyzed here. In the Stoic system, the world soul, which is distinct from the passivity of matter insofar as it suffuses and subtends the latter, providentially governs the world. It is logos and foresees events in a unique series that excludes chance. It is decision or power of decision that creates emarmene. Conversely, with Lucretius, physis is not a logos. It is a veritable force. There is a difference in Epicurean nature and Stoic nature between an intention and a tendency, between a volition and a desire. The force of nature acts on the ensemble of the universe, but not to determine this or that fact. This power of nature is revealed in the richness of chance. At the limit, the infinity of space and time are characteristic of this physis. They expand the domain of chance by conferring positive infinity onto it. It is due to this positive infinite that chance becomes the power of nature, or at least allows physis to exert itself through chance instead of determining the future states of a closed and limited world, a cosmos wherein everything is in relation with everything else. For the Stoics, the world is an individual, and physis can only be providential and necessitating. Right, so this first bit here has to do with the beginning of Lucretius's book, De Rerum Natura, where he talks about, or he uses the term Venus. And Venus, of course, was the Roman name for Aphrodite and was the goddess of love. So in some respects, Lucretius criticizes the traditional Greek and Roman mythology, but he is willing to use the term Venus here for this principle of the sort of generative power of nature, this principle that leads individuals to reproduce and that makes nature fertile. And so this is what Lucretius means by Venus in the opening of the book. And Simondon here compares this with the Ionian physics, this notion of physis that we find in the Ionian physiologists that we saw a few weeks ago when we read the earlier part of this text. But the difference here is that this notion of physis is one that is completely non-teleological. So there's no notion of finality built into this picture of nature. So the world is not governed by providence or something that has a goal or intention in mind. It's nature acts through chance, and we'll see more on that later. But there's this sort of power of chance and randomness that brings about the combinations of atoms and the formation of more and more complex entities through combination. And it's only because space and time are infinite that every possible combination of those atoms and of those smaller composites is possible. And that's why this world, or this depiction of the world, is one in which there's no finality. It's all about causes and chance. Those are the sort of principles that govern the world.
Yeah, I think the notion of the rejection of necessity in Lucretius's philosophy is interesting. It seems like in the last section on the Epicureans, the rejection of necessity was a result of the replacement of cosmos, I guess, with void. So there couldn't really be any action of the cosmos on the individual atoms, which could be teleological. But at the beginning of this section, Simondon seems to say that there is a kind of action of the cosmos in Lucretius, and it is what the power of Venus, as you were describing it, the generative power. And so I think you just said this, but the notion of contingency here seems to be linked to the idea of the infinity of space and time in the universe. I don't totally understand how in infinite space and time means that everything is contingent, but it makes me think of the idea that I think the second law of thermodynamics, in a closed system, entropy can never decrease, but in an open system, I think it can decrease. It's very late here, and that's kind of a half-baked thought, but I wonder if there's any connection between entropy and necessity and contingency here.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting suggestion. I think the notion of, or the role that the infinity of the universe is playing here is a somewhat different one. I think the idea is that because space and time are infinite, it means that every possible combination of atoms will eventually happen, or will happen somewhere in space and time. And so we'll see later on, this there's a sort of evolutionary story that Lucretius wants to tell as well, and this is sort of superimposed on these chance encounters. So and this is also similar to what we saw with sorry, I lost the name here, the guy that jumps in the volcano.
Empedocles.
Empedocles, yes, sorry. Yeah, so Empedocles had the same this evolutionary story in which you have the formation of these monsters where a head and an arm or a foot and a torso or whatever just sort of join together, and it's only as a result of the monsters dying out that we have the sort of well structured forms that we see today. So Lucretius has a similar story where there's these chance encounters of atoms that form these composites, and those composites in turn have these chance encounters, and some of them are viable entities that survive and reproduce themselves, and some are these sort of monsters that are not viable. So it's this combination of the chance encounter and then the evolutionary story, or this evolutionary explanation of the reproduction of entities that those two combined together are the explanation for the structure that we observe in the world. And so because so the openness of the system here, I think we can conceive of this as an open system in the thermodynamic sense, because everything there's this constant input of energy through the fall of the atoms in the void. So the whole universe is a kind of open system because everything is constantly falling in the void, and this is the sort of input of energy that allows for the formation of structure and complex entities in the universe.
Thank you. That makes sense.
But yeah, the relationship between open and closed systems, or the relationship between thermodynamics in general and chance and like thermodynamics is a sort of statistical uh, I don't know, domain of physics. It has to do with the chance, the probability of encountering a particle in a certain volume of space, or the probability that a certain state will be reached in a certain amount of time, and so on. And so there's definitely a close connection between thermodynamic concepts and these notions of the chance encounters of atoms in the void.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, and like in the 19th century, there's sort of two streams of thought that combine in the history of thermodynamics. Like when thermodynamics starts to become a field, you have like the sort of phenomenological thermodynamics. So this is like looking at large systems like steam engines and seeing like how the a steam engine transforms heat into motion, for example. Um, and sort of what the conservation of energy implies in that type of system. And then you also have the statistical stream, which is an explicitly atomistic depiction of physical entities with Boltzmann and people like that, that they have an atomistic conception of gases in particular, but of physical entities in general, that they're composed of these atoms that are, moving around in these sort of random patterns, and we can use statistical principles to try to understand the overall behavior of the aggregates, and that's sort of those two streams combine into forming what is now thermodynamics.
That's very interesting. Yeah, Boltzmann seems like in particular, a really interesting character.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a lot about him, but yeah, he's to a large extent responsible for reviving the atomistic hypothesis that was sort of not really in favor in the like mid to late 19th century, and yeah, so he sort of brought it back to life and had to fight against a lot of opposition at the time, people that thought that this was a misguided approach to physics, and obviously there was a lot of like this revival of the atomistic hypothesis has had a lot of productive effects in physics, and so there's you see this hypothesis that in ancient Greece was a kind of thought experiment almost. There's like very little empirical evidence that you can use to base it on, but it gets revived at various times throughout history and becomes more and more sort of empirically specified, so that you can actually understand atoms as real physical entities and not just as a sort of thought experiment. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. So we're at the top of 497 in the PDF. Conversely, we see Lucretius.
Okay, I can read. Conversely, we see Lucretius in his description of the way the successive encounters of atoms within the void most often engender unviable beings that return to their elements. Say, when speaking of nature, conata est nequiquam, she strove in vain. Nature strives in this way, but since she strives through the infinity of chance, she does not create any necessity. Her effort has no predetermined end, but it can have a meaning in its results because it is always identical to itself. The individual being makes of the effort of nature what the elementary corpuscle with the clinamen makes of the force of falling in the infinite void. There is no rhythm, no definite tension with which the individual must become syntonic. Force of nature, like what we will today call a potential energy, is always available. Ethics harmonizes with this conception of individuality. Unlike the Stoics, the Epicureans do not have an ethics-oriented physics. There is no systematic bond between a physical dogma and an ethical norm with the Epicureans, because for them there is no physical dogmatism. Physics is indeed studied for the knowledge that it can provide concerning the nature of being, but it deploys its own organization in a climate of extremely broad intellectual freedom. There is no subordination of physics to ethics. Physics is truly a generative physics is truly a principle. I don't know where I got that word from. the constitutive element of a doctrine and not just an integral part determined by the ensemble. The fundamental schema of Epicurean thought is conserved even in knowledge. The element is constitutive and remains free. The consequence of physical atomism is that it removes all substantiality from the composite that the living being is. Veritable substantiality belongs to the atomic molecules, not to the composite. The composite only subsists until a force superior to the mutual cohesion of the particles that constitute it eventually dissolves it. Thus, one could speak of a relative and limited substantiality of the composite individual, which results from the mutual relation of its constituents, the semina rerum, the seeds of things, but which, when the composite is generated and exists, indeed belongs to it, and does not depend on a broader principle. There is no marmine, I'm not sure if that's right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That externally governs the duration of the composite individual according to a cosmic order. In Epicureanism, there are none of these privileged and crucial moments of time, kairoi, wherein the activity of the singular individual encounters the rhythm of the world with which to become syntonic. The manner of following nature is quite different in the two doctrines. In Stoicism, nature is the rhythm and movement of the whole, whereas in Epicureanism, nature is at the level of the elementary semina rerum that constitute each composite being. The being does not have to seek a coincidence with the unique movement that rationally governs the universe. The being has within itself, not qua singular being, but qua composite, formed by the semina rerum, this fundamental and immutable reality that is nature in each of her seeds. In the swirling pulverulence of dust, amidst an oblique ray of sunlight in the whirlwind of uplifted sediment, the individual sees and bears witness to what it is. The matter that we see and touch, the poppy seed that flows like liquid when broken by hand, dirt, stone, and steel, are nature just as much as the forests and the teeming waters of the sea. Sensation is the contact between the matter that we're outside us, which is tangible and sensorial because touching and feeling are the actions of atoms in a soul composed of atoms. There is no mediation that exists and must exist between man and things. This very profound, very moving love of things in Lucretius is quite far from being a search for poetic beauty. Pure sensation and immediate sensibility are one and the same thing in Epicureanism. To follow nature is to be linked to her in an immediate and elementary way, to be particulate in some manner. All mediations are ruled out, whether they stem from the search for pleasure, from passion, from ambition, or from fear. There's not so much enjoyment, but sensation that must be conserved. The appetite for enjoyment prevents sensation because it erects the artificiality of pleasure between man and the natural thing. The austerity of sensation and its profound gravity demonstrate the necessity of a veritable contemplation of thought and a repose of the body so that this contact with natural matter can be established. I guess I'll stop there. This idea of a separation between physics and ethics doesn't entirely make sense to me. He says that unlike the Stoics, well, maybe the point is that the Epicureans don't start from an ethics or don't orient their physics on the basis of an ethics, but it does still seem like there's a necessary connection between Epicurean physics and Epicurean ethics.
Yeah, I think you're right that there definitely is a connection between the physics and the ethics. It's not just sort of a haphazard combination of one set of physics and another ethics. What I think he might be getting at when he talks about this sort of the fact, or when he says that Epicureans do not have an ethics-oriented physics, he might be talking about how in Epicureanism there's a certain hypothetical nature to the physics. Like in some of Epicurus's letters, he I forget exactly what phenomenon he's talking about, but anyway, someone asked him about like, how do you explain this natural phenomenon? And he gives like 3 different explanations, and he says you can sort of pick whichever one you like best. And what matters is really knowing that this phenomenon is not some is not something that the gods send to us for a reason or something like that. It's not a warning or a punishment or a blessing or whatever. It's just a physical event that happens. and the specifics of like which explanation you pick are sort of secondary to that. And so in Epicureanism, the actual investigation of physical phenomena and the types of explanations that are proposed are sort of independent from the specifics of the ethical position in a way that is not the case in Stoicism. I think that's maybe what Simondon is getting at here.
That makes sense. So for the Stoics, physics has to be this like Pythagorean approach to harmonics in order for the ethics to make sense. But that's not necessarily the case for the Epicureans and their physics.
Right. Yeah. So the only thing that the physics really contributes to the ethics for the Epicureans is this non-mysteriousness, I guess you could say, or this um, opposition to teleological explanation. So as long as you have a physics that fits those criteria, then the specifics of like how you explain, I don't know, rainbows or lightning or whatever other phenomena are sort of independent of that. And so you can, when Simondon says here, there's this freedom, intellectual freedom, it's because you can propose various different explanations of a particular phenomenon and the ethical implications.
That makes sense.
And so then we also see here this account of the composite in Epicurean physics, so that there's a sort of principle that governs the composite entity, this semina rerum, these seeds of things. There's a kind of overall structure of the composite, but this is just a sort of combination of atoms in a particular way. It's not something. It's not something independent of the atoms, and so entities, composite entities, are they have a certain cohesion or sort of self-subsistence, but it's a contingent cohesion. It lasts for a certain amount of time until something comes along that dissolves it or breaks it up or whatever. And so there's only cohesion is something that comes into being and lasts for a certain amount of time and then disappears when the entity is dies or is broken up or whatever. And so this is just a sort of passing cohesion and a passing coherence of entities. And it's not there's nothing that sort of there's nothing like the Aristotelian form that is sort of unifying the entity in this more fundamental way. And there's also as a sort of consequence of this notion of the composite, there's no sort of incorporation of the individual into a cosmic order, as we talked about earlier. There's no sense in which the individual has to sort of resonate to the order of the universe, like in Stoicism, or to sort of fit in with with this rhythm of the universe or anything along those lines. It's in the same way as you have this individuality of the atoms. There's also a sort of individuality of the human individual that is not incorporated into a cosmic order. And so the ethics is an individual ethics, as opposed to the Stoic ethics, which has this sort of universality to it. And then there's also here mention of or allusion to a passage in Lucretius where he talks about how you can sort of get an idea of what the atoms are by looking at dust swirling in a sunbeam. And this is this is basically the only sort of empirical basis for atomism. This sort of phenomenon of dust swirling in the sunbeam, or the other example is like seeing sediment being stirred up by a whirlpool or something along those lines. These are sort of experiences that form the empirical basis for the doctrine, but everything else is kind of an abstraction from these kinds of experiences. And so there's like this power of thought to extrapolate from these very limited experiences and make them into these sort of universal principles in Epicureanism that I think is very appealing. And then we also see here this notion or some of the consequences of the idea that all action is action through contact, and so this applies to sensation as well. So when we see something, it's because something from the entity. If you see a tree off in the distance, there's some flow of particles off of the tree that strikes your eye and produces the image of the tree. And if you hear a sound, it's because there's something that comes off of the guitar or harp or whatever, and it flows into your ear and produces the vibrations in your ear and so on. Every sensation is the product of some kind of efflux, some flow of particles off of the entity that you are sensing, and so there's nothing like a kind of mediation required. There's no problem of how we have access to entities, how we are connected to entities in sensation, because sensation is just the action of an entity on us through this flow of particles, and so this also has a sort of ethical consequence in that there's a kind of search for sensation in this pure sense. So the one of the sort of principles of the Stoic ethics, or sorry, the Epicurean ethics, is this sort of allowing pleasure to govern our lives, but not in the sense of seeking out elaborate pleasures and luxuries and so on, but having a kind of simplicity of a contact with entities. So you can just have your bread and water and have the pleasure of just being in contact with that bread and water and being in touch with nature and aligned with nature through that contact with reality. And this is sort of the ethical consequence of this physical doctrine of the action through contact.
I can read again since you just did a long explanation.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Shit, I can't remember where I stopped. Did I stop at the man who seeks? Yeah, I think so.
Yes, that's right.
The man who seeks ephemeral pleasure turns his back on the object. He is isolated from nature, and he is deranged. Like the maniac, he does not know how to enjoy further. He hurries from the city to his home in the countryside, yet, having just arrived, he sets out again, overriding his horses as though his house were on fire. The state of ataraxia is precisely what gives legitimacy to veritable sensation, constituting an entire aspect of the sage in the Templa Serena Philosophiae, the serene temples of philosophy. Science is not opposed to sensation. It adds to the sensible by extending it beyond the limits of our senses toward the degrees of invisible smallness. The characteristics of atomic particles could be sensible if our sense organs were of the same size, or rather on the same scale. Even in the approximate and conjectural knowledge of physics, realism, which is linked in Epicurean doctrine to the theory of sensation by contact, is perpetually conserved. With a little bit of barley bread and water, the sage can compete with the bliss of Zeus, the same way he can know the reality of things with absolute sensation by contact. The realism of sensation in the state of ataraxia does not require enjoyment to provide happiness, nor does it require mathematical formalism to yield science. This doctrine thus leads to a research of sensation as contact of the similar with the similar. In the same way, the social relation is an assimilation first and foremost. Epicurean friendship certainly must be interpreted in this way. It is a homogeneity of lifestyle with tastes, desires, and ways of thinking. It is hardly possible to conceive a search for the other qua other, and this is undoubtedly why sexuality rarely intervenes except as an obstacle. as the danger of alienation, as a loss of ataraxia. It is the source of natural but unnecessary pleasures. Lucretius remains content with acknowledging surgit amari aliquid, something bitter arises, without analyzing more deeply why this undetermined bitterness arises and what it is the sign of. Sexuality does not suffice unto itself, and Lucretius sees in it, above all, a sort of unreasonableness, without seeking to discover the postulation of a relation that would free the individual from himself, and free sensation from the relation of the similar to the similar. Relation, which in the Stoics was invested with the highest power, becomes, qua familial or social relation, a dangerous thing for the Epicureans. Perhaps this is the serious difficulty of Epicurean thought. It is difficult to consider relation as so inessential to the individual. Lucretius himself acknowledges the importance of civic life in the development of civilization, which protects man from natural dangers like beasts, lightning, and the cold. The method of veritable life, according to wisdom and fact, resides in the individual's knowledge of the limited nature of his life, both in terms of time and in his capacity to feel and enjoy. Man, above all, is a limited being, and all his unhappiness stems from his incapacity to know his real limits. Man believes to maintain relations with realities that do not exist or will never be in contact with them, affirming the complete inanity of every relation that is not in actual contact. Epicureanism wants to eradicate false ideas, which overwhelm man by uprooting him from himself, and which follow from a false belief in relations that do not exist. Man lives in fear of the gods. According to Lucretius, Epicurus is the first to have lifted his eyes toward the elevated regions where the gods dwell to understand and make known to men that the gods, if they exist, do not preoccupy themselves with men, since they are all too happy to be in a state of ataraxia themselves. But what uproots the individual being from himself is the fear of death. This fear depends on the myth of an existence after death, a sad and tenebrous existence full of torments, horror, and desolation, diminished and lamentable life, without hope and without light, just like what Homer evokes in the Nechoia, rites by which ghosts are summoned to answer questions about the future, and of the Odyssey. A celebrated dead warrior says that he would prefer to be a worker for a poor farmer than the prince of the empire of the dead. Lucretius finds himself facing all these depressing representations of a dark and painful existence where nothing remains of life except misery. Misery and existence after death are inextricable for the ancients. Lucretius claims that men would not seek wealth so much if they weren't afraid of poverty, and that they wouldn't be afraid of poverty if acris agestis, severe poverty, were not for them a tangible image of future existence. I don't know why he doesn't just say Achilles here.
Yeah, that was, I don't know, that was kind of weird and surprising.
Yeah.
But yeah, so here, we have a lot of the doctrines of Epicureanism sort of evoked in this couple pages. So there's this idea that this idea of simple pleasures, as opposed to seeking for some sort of infinite pleasure. Our suffering as human beings comes from our sort of imagination that we could have an infinite amount of pleasure. So if only you were like a little bit richer, you would have, a better, set of horses that would give you more pleasure. Or if you had, the next level of political office, then you would, have the admiration of your fellow citizens, and you would have more pleasure, and so on. Always striving for some greater degree of pleasure, as opposed to just enjoying the whatever you have now. So this is one of the characteristic doctrines of the Epicurean school, that the striving after more pleasure, or this infinite this mythological depiction, or this imaginary depiction of infinite pleasure, is what leads to our suffering, because we feel that we're lacking something, as opposed to being content with what we have. So this is one of the key doctrines of the Epicurean Ethics. And then we also have, we just saw the beginning of this section, but this bit about the fear of death as another source of our suffering. And there's the famous argument that that we should not be afraid of death because where death is, I am not, and where I am, death is not. So after death, you don't survive as a kind of, I don't know, ghost or spirit or whatever. There's just nothing. There's nothing to be afraid of because there's no you after death to suffer or be miserable or anything like that. So death is not something we should be afraid of. It's just the end of our existence. And so the fear of death leads us to, uh, you know, all kinds of actions that bring about our suffering. We prepare, prepare for warfare because we're afraid that someone else is going to kill us. We have to kill them first, and this leads to all kinds of suffering and um, uh, so the fear of death and the desire for some sort of infinite pleasure, and these are related in the sense that we fear death because we are sort of in denial about the finitude of our existence. So we feel like death is a kind of injustice or something that happens to us against our sort of desire to live indefinitely or to have an infinite life. But if we just sort of accepted our finitude and accepted that we have this finite life with finite pleasures, then we would not have this striving that causes all this suffering. And Simondo also here, going back up a little bit, he talks about what he describes as being maybe the most serious difficulty for Epicureanism, which has to do with sexuality in particular, but relations to others in general. So Epicureanism is, as I mentioned earlier, it treats the individual as the individual human being as a sort of isolated individual, and this is the sort of ideal. The sage is someone who is self-sufficient and who doesn't rely on anything from others to enjoy pleasure. But this sort of runs into conflict with other things that Lucretius recognizes about how living with others in cities and forming a society is beneficial to human beings. That we are protected from natural disasters and wild animals and so on. We have a greater possibility for enjoyment and for pleasure through association with others than we would if we were just sort of individuals left to our own devices. And then in sexuality in particular, the Epicureans and Lucretius specifically, they see this as something dangerous and something that leads you away from the life of a sage. But there's a sort of difficulty here because they recognize that sexuality is a kind of natural pleasure, but at the same time they see it as something that can sort of distract you from the life of the sage, and in general they are sort of in denial about any sort of relational aspect of human life or any aspect of human life that involves relation to others, and so this is what Simondo sees as one of the biggest weaknesses of the Epicurean school, is they have no account of the relational aspect of human life.
The point that he makes about similarity of tastes, desires, and ways of thinking in friendship, is the idea there just that similarity is, I guess, friendships in which there is this kind of similarity are more immediate or less mediated? Otherwise, I'm not really sure how that relates to the physics of sensation.
Yeah, I think the idea is that in the same way, so when we see something, when we see red, we see, I don't know, red sunset or whatever, there's a certain contact between the sun with its stream of particles that strikes our eye and produces the sensation of red. there's a similarity between the entity that produces the stream of particles and the affection or the impact of that stream of particles on our body. There's this relation of similarity that between what is sensed and the sensation. And then likewise, in the case of friendship, what the kind of social relation, the only kind of social relation that Epicureanism sort of allows or gives any validity to is a social relation of similarity. So you select or you associate with other individuals that you share, lifestyle and tastes and so on with, as opposed to in the Stoic system, there's this sort of relation to the universal state, these various empires of Alexander or of Cyrus or whoever, these states that have a universal ambition. And this involves a kind of relation to the rest of humanity in this through the mediation of the state or through the mediation of the ruler of the state. And so this is a less immediate kind of relation than this sort of friendship with someone who shares various features with you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And in particular, we saw an earlier mention of the way that the Epicureans are sort of withdrawn from public life, the life of the city in the ancient world, in a way that the Stoics are not. The Stoics, like we have Marcus Aurelius, who we'll see later, who was one of the Roman emperors, who was a Stoic, and there was a close association between the Stoics and the rulers of some of the Hellenistic states. Whereas the Epicurus himself was forced to leave Athens for several years, and the Epicureans formed these sort of not quite outcasts, but they were like these sort of private associations that were not part of the public life of the cities where they lived. And so the Epicurean friendship is always something. It's this sort of immediate relation of one individual with another or with a small group of other individuals, as opposed to the Stoic cosmopolitanism, which is a relation to others through this vast institution that is the empire of Alexander or Cyrus. Okay, let's go on to the next bit, which I can read. Yeah, here we are. And at any rate, funeral rites indeed show us this alliance of poverty and death. Rags and the ash poured over one's head and clothes. Rags and the ash poured over one's head and clothes express mourning for the ancient. This belief, which uproots man from this manner of consisting in oneself that is provided by the plenitude of the moment, lived for itself in the present of sensation, is rejected by Lucretius for the idea that death is nothing positive, merely a passage from being to nothingness. There is a logical and psychological illusion in the idea that the individual can be dead. After death, there is nothing. The individual has ceased to be. Only the atomic molecules that composed him remain. For a state to be felt, there must be a soul, and this soul, which is made of the lightest atoms, dissipates and loses its unity when this bodily vessel loses its airtightness at the moment of death. One can but die, one cannot be dead, for the dead being is no longer an individual. He no longer has a soul or unity. The nothingness afterlife is symmetrical with the nothingness before it. The idea of an afterlife is the result of an illusion. Through a sort of splitting, the individual being imagines standing beside his own corpse, weeping for himself. But this splitting never happens. This being will dissipate but will not split. He will be annihilated and not diminished. Thus the individual lives in conformity with a law of all or nothing, thereby leaving no place for influences for obscure and hidden relations. Everything that exists actually, in the instantaneous present, and events are merely the results of particular molecular action. Furthermore, unlike with Stoicism, there is no valorization of the fact with the Epicureans. The fact is pure result. Science seeks to know the causes of things, not their end. This doctrine is neither anthropocentric nor theocentric. Stoicism is a mystical rationalism wherein reason becomes that which makes it possible to know the ends of things. The Epicureans' realist intellectualism is opposed to this rationalism. According to this mode of knowledge, which also supposes a certain conception of being, there is no circular process of reality in the simple or composite being. In this case, sensation, contact without recurrence, and action by immediate contact, exchange of one being with another, are supposed to constitute the whole order of the real. Conversely, in finalist rationalism, every being tries to rediscover its own cause within itself and attempts without modification to transform, albeit only through the conversion of the state of fact into right, its situation into an aspect of the finality of the cosmos. The justification and rationalization of the world ultimately amounts to a self-justification and a discovery of the individual's validity. The opposition between Stoicism and Epicureanism is that of a philosophy which defines the individual as what acts upon itself to a philosophy which defines the individual by its limits, which are known based on their genesis. These two doctrines attempt to know what the order of succession is in the individual being, but they become separate after this shared intention. In short, Epicureanism finds in the independence and perfection of the instant, as well as in the independence of this succession of instants, that is life relative to the part as a whole and the future as a whole, the method for grasping the individual in its highest reality. Conversely, Stoicism seeks in the link of each instant to the whole of life, and in the link of the whole of life to the world's movement, the condition for the conversion of the individual being, which is integrated into the totality. Epicureanism seeks the causes, where Stoicism seeks the ends. The knowledge of ends joins together many successive converging instants. The knowledge of causes isolates each instant as a final product of everything that has engendered it. In the instant, the knowledge of causes attaches to contemporary beings. The knowledge of ends straddles the present and unifies duration by leading the being to react upon itself, to will itself, to cause itself. Consequently, the unity of the temporal series can only be gained at the price of an integration into the necessary order of the universe, according to a rationalist finalism. Conversely, the unity of the self-consistent instant can only be obtained at the price of a discontinuity introduced into the succession of the individual states by privileging causality and leaving out any relation of finality, which makes each instant overflow itself. Relation sacrifices the independence of the individual in the instant, and its independence sacrifices continuity, the unity of the series. The same back and forth swaying as the one that opposed the system of relation in accordance with simultaneity to the doctrine of the fulfillment of the being in itself appears here. Each presupposition concerning individuality leads to its contrary. So we have more here on this account of death and the fear of death in Epicureanism. So there's a sort of illusion in the idea of being dead. You sort of imagine yourself next to your corpse and mourning yourself. This is an image that Lucretius uses. You picture yourself as dead, but also as like observing yourself being dead. Whereas in reality, there is no such thing as being dead. You die. There's an event of dying. And after that, there's nothing. There's no you to be dead or to experience death. And so, because of this, we shouldn't fear death as a state that we will sort of be in. We should see death just as a kind of happening or the end of our lifespan, and not as a state that we'll be in. And so there's nothing more to fear about the state of nothingness after death than there was to fear about the state of nothingness before we were born. And so they're equally just states of nothingness. And then Simondon draws some consequences of this account of death in contrast with the Stoic philosophy of the individual. So for the Epicureans, it's only what exists now that truly exists. There's a sort of instantaneous nature of existence, and then the future is something that doesn't have a true existence, or is something that doesn't have reality. Whereas in Stoicism, there's this finality to the universe, and so in a sense, it's the goal of the universe, the end that the universe is oriented towards, that is ultimately real, and everything is just sort of pointing towards that end. And so Simondon argues here that we have a similar kind of opposition as the one that we saw earlier between Plato and Aristotle, between the order of simultaneity and the order of succession, where here we have an opposition where the Stoics are capable of grasping this finality and orientation toward the future, but they can only do so by incorporating the individual into this greater cosmic order and kind of dissolving the individual in this cosmic order. Whereas the Epicureans grasp the individual as a separate being, but they do so at the cost of kind of losing this orientation toward the future. And so each side of this opposition sort of grasps one side of what it is to be a human individual, but they lose the other side and have to deny the validity of the other side. And so what Simondon is going to want to do is to be able to grasp both of these sides at the same time. So to have an account of the human individual that accounts both for the separateness of the individual and also for the sort of pointing towards the future and the incorporation of the individual into greater collectives than collectives of greater size than the individual. Okay. I'm going to suggest that we stop here unless there are any other questions or comments before we end. And then we can pick up from, well, there's this little summary, and then we'll pick up from the, what's the next one? Actually, the summary is a bit longer than I thought. Anyway, we have the Cynics and Pyrrho and some of the other philosophers after that.
Why do you think he stops with, I mean, Lucretius was a Roman poet, or a Roman philosopher, right? Is it just because he's, I guess, as you said earlier, he's the source of, like, our knowledge of Epicureanism. So the division ends with the Greeks here, but includes Lucretius.
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain overlap between like Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy. Of course, you have Greek philosophers who are writing in the Roman era. So when we'll see later, Plotinus, for example, was from Egypt, which was a Greek or from the Greek colony in Egypt at the time, but it was part of the Roman Empire. So there are Greek philosophers writing in the Roman era that we'll see in the next few readings that we get through.
Okay, that makes sense. And then at the bottom of page 502 for me, when he's talking about when he says in the Epicurean realist intellectualism, there's no circular process of reality in the simple or composite being. The circular process of reality, does that have to do with the incorporation of the individual into the cosmos and Stoic thought? I'm not sure what that reference to circularity is.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the finalism of the Stoic physics.
Okay.
So he's I think appealing here or sort of alluding here to some of the cybernetic principles about or the cybernetic understanding of finality in terms of feedback mechanisms and circular causality.
Okay.
So like in some of the early cybernetic devices that like the homeostat.
Homeostat, right?
Yeah, so it has this circular causality because its own current state feeds back into the so the device measures its current state and then measures the difference between that current state and the goal state, and then it acts in such a way to reduce that difference, and then it measures again and so on. So it will constantly reduce that difference and try to preserve a certain goal state. And so this picture of this is sort of the picture that Simondon is using for how an entity can have a sort of finalism to it. It has this circular causality where it acts on itself. It measures itself or observes itself or measures whatever state it happens to be in, and then it acts on its own state and then brings about a new state which is closer to whatever the goal state is.
So is he saying that Stoics are like homeostats?
In a sense, yes. Yeah. So he's sort of so the Stoic sage is a kind of homeostat that seeks, to maintain this resonance with the universe. So this is the sort of goal state. So every every entity in the universe has its own sort of particular frequency of resonance with the universe, and finding that state and maintaining it is what the goal of the sage is.
That's a pretty funny image. The state is sort of regulating its own temperature.
Yeah, and you can see why you might think that this is maybe a kind of limited conception of human individuality. That if you conceive of human action as just being oriented towards preserving a kind of goal state, and resonating with the universe and so on, it kind of leaves out the independence of the individual, which is what the Epicureans are emphasizing. And so Simondon wants to have an account of human individuality that is capable of doing justice to both aspects at the same time, and not just sort of selecting one and denying the other.
Right, that makes sense. This is related to his distinction between consciousness and conscience earlier, where he says that I think he says, the slave is never just a speaking tool, because there's always the possibility of like a reorientation or revaluation.
Yeah, so that would be so that, like, if the slave were just a speaking tool, just a sort of device that is oriented towards some end that you select for it, then the slave would be a kind of homeostat that just resonates with the frequency of whatever the master selects as the goal state.
Right.
But because the slave always has this capacity to reject those goals, or to institute new goals, or restructure its set of goal states, that means that the slave is never purely a speaking tool, or purely a homeostat.
Unlike the Stoic sage, apparently.
Yeah, and so this is also related to, I mean, this was like a sort of saying of the Stoics, that you can be a sage whether you're the emperor or a slave. You still have the same freedom, and we can see that this is a pretty limited conception of freedom, because if you're free as a slave, or if your freedom is the same thing whether you're a slave or an emperor, it's a pretty it's just a thin notion of freedom.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I agree with that.
Right. So any other questions or comments before we end for today?
None from me.
Cool. Okay. So let's end here, and we'll pick up. Let me make sure I write this down this time. Pick up from page 501. Okay. So thanks for coming out, and hopefully see you next week.